Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. And this is how I'm going to be structuring my speech. First off, I'll start off with certain essential definitions and characterizations, moving on to why we believe that hyper-individualism is something that we can go ahead and declare, right? But firstly, what does hyper-individualism go ahead and look like in this particular paragraph, right? You need to understand there's an inherent difference between hyper-individualism and selfishness. That's the first point of characterization that needs to be made in this debate, right? At the point in time where we go ahead and see that a person's ability to prioritize their own need, that's a common principle for selfishness and hyper-individualism, right? The distinction, however, comes in your ability to go ahead and make that trade-off in the first place. What does this trade-off essentially look like, right? At the point in time where you're going ahead and being hyper-individualistic, you aren't able to understand what the trade-off essentially looks like. This trade-off is basically, what am I getting? But however, at a point in time where you go ahead and get any sort of thing, what is it that the other person is losing? This sort of ability to go ahead and create this distinction is something which is inherently available when you go ahead and become selfish rather than hyper-individualistic. At a point in time where you're not able to identify what is the distinction between the sort of benefit that you're going ahead and accruing, but on the other hand, what sort of harms do you go ahead and deal on to others, that's the basic distinction that you aren't able to make in hyper-individualistics. In hyper-individualism, that's a sort of definition which opposition has to engage with. Why is it? It's essentially problematic. Two reasons, two primary reasons as to why, followed by their mechanization. A, why this institution of trust goes ahead and falls down, but B, why is collaborations and cooperation between the society essentially important, right? You need to understand that at a point in time that trust is based solely off of questioning somebody's intentions. You need to understand that at a point in time, you are not really aware of what somebody's intentions behind their actions essentially are. Trust is something which is depleted on our side of the house, right? At a point in time where you aren't able to recognize why is it that somebody might be doing any sort of a good deed, why is it, or what are the real intentions behind anybody's essential, what is the real reason why anybody is doing anything? Trust is something which can't be built on this particular side of the house, right? Why does that become important? What does it lead to? What does this lack of trust in the society essentially look like, right? At a point in time, you need to understand that the society is inherently based off of prejudices, right? At a point in time where this trust is something which is inherently broken, we believe it leads to an amplification of these pre-existing prejudices which are seen in the form of xenophobic ideas or racism as a whole, right? At a point in time where this concept of us as a society goes away, it leads to an amplification of this entire argumentation that there is a distinction between your own class and the other class. At a point in time, I can't go ahead and trust any sort of the other community. The people who I go ahead and rely my trust upon are the people who I believe, whom I've interacted with the most, the people I've grown on to and have been enforced to go ahead and like essentially. At a point in time that goes ahead and happens, the ideals of xenophobia or racism are something which get exacerbated, right? You need to understand how does any sort of hatred accrue in this particular society. Prejudice is something which is there inherently, but secondly, we also believe that it's a constant ignorance of somebody else's pain, which leads to us not being actually able to realize what the sort of implications of our actions essentially look like, right? At a point in time where you've retrospectively seen this in terms of refugees in the European crisis, you go ahead and see that a lot of these countries go on to have closed or shut down borders because they aren't able to even identify the sort of trade-off which is happening at a point in time where they go ahead and only try to prioritize their own needs. At a point in time, they aren't even able to understand what the trade-off might look like, or they aren't able to imagine what sort of a benefit might accrue to somebody else, because all they've been focusing upon is this inherent assumption that these people go on to pollute their particular environment, go on to potentially increase the sort of criminal activities in their particular country. That's a sort of xenophobic, that's a sort of racism, that's a sort of hatred which is exacerbated on our side of the paradigm. But then, why do we believe trust also becomes crucially important in terms of the sort of relationships that we go ahead and form, whether it be personal or professional? That at a point in time where I've already classified to you why trust becomes why trust becomes an inherent part of this debate, you also need to understand that once that trust is something which has gone away, vulnerability is also something which goes away. At the point in time that I don't know whom to talk about what, there's no way that I can actually go ahead and represent my true ideas. I can't create that sort of personal relationship or have that sort of relationship in the first place. At the point in time where these relationships become extremely important in the sort of capitalistic society that we're currently living in, I don't have a sort of safe space to go on, to rely on, to actually talk about what my day looks like, or to actually go ahead and have a serious conversation. But then it's also important in your professional life, because at a point in time where professional life is something which is clearly dictated by the way that you interact with other people, the way you actually have some sort of a collaboration, it essentially becomes important for you to actually have that sort of safe working environment for you to actually go ahead and proceed in your career, right? But then second idea is why collaborations essentially become important. You need to understand the only way that you get any sort of social change in the society is through collaboration. At a point in time where there is a wealth disparity, where only a couple of people actually have the sort of privilege to go ahead and bring about this change in the first place, you have to have certain sense of collaboration with these people actively going out of their way to give up the sort of privileges that they have so that there can actually be a social change. Before I move on to that, a quick view I can see.
If selfish trade-offs are that bad and if you only need deadlines, the implications of how the harms being caused to the society are good enough for deadlines. Engage.
That's the entire problem, right? People don't understand what's the sort of harm that is happening. At the point in time where they go ahead and you have the sort of identity or the ideals of hyper-individualism, the entire point of them being able to recognize the harm that they're causing goes away even further on your paradigm. But then why is collaboration essentially important, and how does social change occur on our side if this idea of hyper-individualism is something which doesn't exist? I was already talked to you how privileged people are the ones who actually have the sort of resources to bring about this change in the first place. At a point in time that these people are the ones whose collaboration you constantly need to bring about this change in the first place, the only way that you get these people to give up on their privilege, the only way that you get a cisgendered white male to argue for feminism, which is literally talking about taking away their privileges in the first place, if they actually go ahead and identify or recognize the sort of sufferings that the feminist movement has been seeing. The only way that you get some sort of social change is if you have active collaborations with the privileged part of the society. The only way those collaborations come about if this entire idea of hyper-individualism is something which is shunned away with. What have we given to you as opening government? Clear distinction between what hyper-individualism looks like, how is it different from selfishness, why do we believe that the institution of trust is something which becomes important in the society, how does all of that go away, why it leads to an amplification of the xenophobic or the racist ideas which are present in the society, you're amplifying the prejudices, exacerbating the condition of the minority community. But lastly, we've also talked to you about why collaboration is something which becomes essentially important in this debate. Before all of those reasons, very, very proud.
Facial expressions are super disruptive. Starting my speech.
Taps are?
Standard taps 1, 6, 7. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate is necessarily placed in the delta between where self-actualization can be better on an individual level as well as a macro level, and we have the requisite mechanisms to prove to you that self-actualization, alienation as well as social change and being able to resist against oppressive structures are likelier to happen on opening opposition. First piece of framing then to complete OG's framing. One, we think at every point in time hyper-individualism is necessarily more extensive than individualism, but we think at every point in time individualism conceptually comes at the cost of breaking out of compliance. What do we tell you then in terms of historical framing? One, we think states are built on the idea that compliance is necessary and a requisite based off of your accident of birth, which means that the only thing making me an Indian is the fact that I was accidentally born within Indian borders, and states use the logic of compliance to justify themselves as well as justify hegemonic actions. We think historically power structures have existed and evolved intrinsically to the way history has evolved, so power structures are intrinsically embedded within these historical processes. But at every point in time, therefore, states need the narrative of compliance to justify their existence as well as justify identities. We think a mechanism by which which they do this is that they have asymmetrically only access to the monopoly on violence, only access to the ideas of being individualistic, because we think state is always something that has historically been individualistic, but people have been robbed of that right. Insofar as this is concerned, we think we're able to frame out that since like say hunter-gatherers, since say like racism or like slavery happened and all of these things historically, there has always been a difference in the access to individualism you have in the sense that minority communities or subaltern people or people with less wealth do not have access to hyper-individualism because they are denied this access because some people have a monopoly over hyper-individualism. Insofar as this is concerned, we think these monopolies are far best broken in the digital age, which brings us to our third piece of framing. We think when you are able to take away this epistemological hegemony, wherein you do not let people know, because if they know, then they will revolt. This is what states have been built on. We think Brahmins have been able to epistemologically hegemonize Dalit people because they do not even let Dalit people actualize, because they don't even allow that information to go to them in the first place. The prerequisite of this trust is that information is denied to them. So any trust and any collaboration is the idea that some people just don't even have the resources to access that in the first place. What then do we tell you changes on our paradigm? Why is collaboration, change, solidarity, empathy all better on our side? One, we think there is an information exchange that comes out of the digital age. Insofar as perspectives and identities are created, we think because of information, you now have access to a lot of different identities. If I am sitting here and Krishaang is sitting there, we might not feel the same way because we are from different ethnic backgrounds, but the idea that we can now talk to each other because we have an incentive to talk to each other and come to an identity that is new, and for that old narrative to collapse is something that is necessarily true on our side. What then does this result in? One, we think alienation is likely to exist in the stage of late stage capitalism anyway. We think alienation on their side means alienation with one another and with yourself. We think on a comparative, we are not going to alienate you for yourself, because if you break down these epistemological barriers, you are likelier to know yourself better, and therefore you are likelier, because of hyper-individualism, you are likelier to know yourself better and know what you want. This leads to better decision making, but we also think this leads to better collaboration, because now you know the incentives you have to collaborate on a social justice movement. We think on their side, alienation happens with yourself because you're necessarily compliant to state structures that tell you you cannot be yourself because it doesn't fit their narrative. I take CEO. CG.
I am a rich person. I continue to be rich with no incentive of catering to people around me. Engage.
I am a rich person. Previously, before the information era, I would have been allowed to not do anything about it or care. Now I have to care because poorer people know that they are poor and they have been oppressed because of rich people, and that is necessarily something that drives poor people to create change. People that are oppressed, that makes my point perfectly. People that are oppressed know now that they are being oppressed. Know now that they are being oppressed and therefore necessarily want to revolt because they know their incentives in that. Impacts wise, we give you two impacts. We think this mitigates most of what government is likely to bring. One, on the idea of discourse and accountability. We think discourse is likely to be better when each of these actors is bound to the ultimate end goal of the movement by their own incentives that are individual rather than a collective sense of empathy. Because at every point in time, dissent comes with a fallback of your safety, right? We think when you have to raise your voice, there is a fallback that you are likely to sustain, and that is something you will be more willing to sustain if you have personal incentives in a movement that come from hyper-individualism rather than empathy for someone else. We think empathy breaks when it comes at personal cost, but if you have personal incentives to take over that personal cost, you are likelier to come out with better change. But second, on better relationships and better self-actualization, before that I'll take OG.
At the point in time where you say that just because these poor people have the information they can call out, do you think they even have the resources for this call out of protest to take place in the first place?
They don't need to have the resources insofar as this debate is concerned, because this debate is about access to individualism. You need to have access to be able to know who you are, what you mean, and what you can achieve. As long as you know that, that's still a marginal delta on our side and you lose. But second, on the idea of better relationships, we think at every point in time, actions are dictated by what's proximate to you. So better power dynamics are likely to happen when you're proximate to causes, when you're proximate to your incentives, when you know what you want and therefore make better decisions out of that. We think OG and then CG maybe, right? One, we think OG says, look, trust breaks down on our side. This is necessarily funny because if that trust exists on ignorance, which is what you're saying, we will not let people individualize because trust will break down, then there is already that information present that there should not be trust because you do not align with someone else's personal incentives. Insofar as that trust is concerned, it is based on something that comes from a lack of knowledge, and if that trust is broken when that knowledge comes about, that trust does not exist at all. But second, we think on the idea that like, look, collaboration is better and states will be hyper-individualistic. I think flipping that argument, states are much more likely to want to be in alliances that are economically and politically and socially beneficial for each other when they are looking towards hyper-individualistic narratives. We think states shut their borders when they think about compliance against individual boundaries because they think they have to act in a way that the state has to act. We think hegemonies are better broken down, but we also think self-actualization is something on our side. Lastly, we think CP can come up with the idea that like, look, there is hate, chaos, society breaks down. We think this is the only thing Gov can realistically, even in the best case, say, but we think this is necessarily untrue preemptively because society is never going to break down because the individual actors within society have no incentives to want society to break down. Hyper-individualism will always exist in a binary to compliance, but we also think hyper-individualism will never stab itself in the foot because individualism means knowing your own incentives. Try to be proud to win on OO.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. While the primary problem with opening opposition's case is they confuse hyper-individualism to some sort of spiritual awakening. As to how does hyper-individualism lead to suddenly self-recognition of everything that I want, everything that I need, and then going forward and attaining it, right? You need to understand hyper-individualism is not recognition of what you need. Hyper-individualism is just acting aggressively on what you perceive you need, right? This is exactly the problem. But also why this actualization is actually worse off in your paradigm. Because how does actualization actually come about? You understand your need, you recognize your personal and professional needs, when you have people, when you have better interactions both in a personal and professional capacity, and Pranav has already explained to you as to how this collaboration and trust deficit break down. So you do not have a safe space where you can have this sort of conversation, you do not have a safe group of people where these conversations exist, right? But also there is secondly to the entire point of how, suddenly, because minorities are now more selfish, they'll be able to get out of the condition they're in. You need to understand, hyper-individualism is not just spreading to the minority section of the society, hyper-individualism also increases the privileged classes of the society. This becomes a problem, essentially why? Because you need to understand, how does the social movement come about? Why would I, as a cis male, go forward and act in a feminist movement or partake in a feminist movement, which actively seeks to take away the privileges, the unfortunate privileges which society has bestowed down upon me, right? This only happens when I have a recognition of, there's some other harms that are accruing to someone else that are actually greater than the benefits that are accruing to me, which is exactly the problem behind hyper-individualism, because you now do not have the ability to sort of make the trade-off. So good privileged actors is something which does not exist in the opposition paradigm. We take that away completely. But also, why do minorities among themselves need this kind of do not need this kind of hyper-individualism? Because you need to understand, hyper-individualism does not exist even at a community level. Even to say mount on protest, you need certain kind of understanding or recognition of, there's other people who want the same benefit as me and are not just partaking in the social movement because they want to go forward and attain personal benefit. So even protests with these or movements need a form of collaboration which cannot occur if hyper-individualism exists. But also, minorities or oppressed classes need to collaborate with the classes that are oppressors, because unfortunately they occupy the pivotal positions that are able to grant those kinds of leeways to which minorities can then go forward and progress. So that form of collaboration also breaks down in their paradigm, right? We take social movements across all four houses. But also secondly, why does collaboration necessarily go down? We need to understand, how does collaboration occur upon? No POS, please don't verbally form. How does collaboration actually occur about? Me and Pranav can collaborate and make a case because we know that at some level we are both aiming to seek benefits that occur to both of us, right? So I'm able to recognize those benefits and I'm able to recognize that, Pranav is not doing something and Pranav has recognition that he will not do something which goes so directly against me, that will actually lead me down. That is exactly the problem. Because collaboration is a two-way street. You need to have recognition of what other side's benefit can be in order for them to go forward and collaborate, which is exactly why collaboration cannot exist in their paradigm. But also to the point of saying, if collaboration is beneficial, I'll still go forward and collaborate because it's in my very own interest. You need to understand why that does not happen. Because the benefits that accrue out of collaborations are long-term benefits. And humans have the tendency to say, prioritize benefits which are much more short-term in nature. So I as a human, instead of going forward and collaborating with another person, which would say, form greater collaborations, greater trust in the society, and eventually help me like get better benefits in the long run, would not pursue that, because in the short run, fucking him over would get me better benefits immediately, right? Which is why immediate benefits mounted with hyper-individualism essentially lead to, say, society going essentially in the wrong direction. But also, how has it materialized in the past? You need to understand that the crux of every oppression or racism that takes place in the society is the inability to recognize what other person is going through over my own privileges, right? Which is that at a point of time, if I'm a xenophobic person, the reason is that I'm unable to quantify or say compare what Rohingyas in Bangladesh are going through or what Syrian refugees are going through as opposed to my own privilege or my own benefits of actually like operating in a society where these people do not have, right? Which is exactly why their inability to weigh that off is something which leads me to kind of down the path of xenophobia and racism. But before moving forward, a very quick view from the close. Opening.
Status quo right now is hyper-individualistic, but people still have collective structures like government, the police, the army. All of your material is uncomparative. Engage.
You cannot come forward and say, oh, parts of hyper-individualism exist in the society and so structures exist. So even if we say support greater rise and recognition of the fact, A, because I am also a hyper-individualistic person who recognizes that the only thing I want is for my greatest benefit, but also the people that I'm working with, I have this kind of sense of fear or danger amongst me that, oh, these people, the only thing this person cares about is his own benefits. So he will not think twice before fucking me over, right? This is the kind of environment that now exists in the world, which is why I cannot go forward and place any kind of trust in this person. But this also then translates down to, say, personal and romantic relationships, which is exactly what it looks like, right? Because these relationships work on the effect of, oh, I have to make certain sacrifices in order to, say, make this relationship work or in order to make my partner work, right? Which is exactly where the point of, say, safe spaces or healthy spaces comes into the picture. At a point of time in your society where everyone is hyper-individualistic, you do not have these safe spaces to go back or fall back upon, right? Which is exactly why we see not just a deficit in, say, the overall social environment, but also a deficit in personal spaces, which directly goes on to impact not just relations, but also mental health of people across the globe because of the lack of spaces. But also the point regarding charity. Charity simply does not exist in their paradigm. At a point of time, you're hyper-individualistic because the concept of philanthropy or charitable donation does not exist, because the very concept stands on the idea that I'll be willing to give something of my own in order to benefit others. The entire idea of empathy does not exist in their paradigm because I do not have the ability to recognize their emotions. I do not have the ability to recognize the pain of other persons over my own benefits, right? Which is why we take this debate. Social movements better, minorities better, personal relationship better. We take it across every stakeholder in existence. Very, very proud to do that.
BOS, however, starting speech, 3, 2, 1. Panel individualism has always existed. What we're trying to tell you is before the digital age, it was a privilege to be individualistic, which means at the point in time you have the amount of resources, have the amount of control to be able to exert your own narrative over other people. You can afford to be individualistic, you can act upon that individualism. What we're talking about in this particular motion is now expanding this axis of individualism to a variety of communities, which means when you regret the rise of something, that's what you have to do. The problem with government bends so far is that the only counterfactual they ever give us is, hey, we have greater trust and empathy, etc. I'm unsure as to what that even looks like, where that even accrues upon, especially when Riddhi comes and tells you that, look, this motion is rooted in this like exchange of information and stuff, which means at the point in time you regret that, you have to give us a well fleshed out counterfactual as to what the world would probably look like when these kinds of things probably did not end up existing. What is the major impact that Riddhi draws to you within her particular speech? I think the biggest challenge that we're getting from government so far is, look, you're not going to have social movements, etc., etc. I think social structures and movements are still likely to exist. The only difference here ends up being is what is the basis of these movements in the first place, where is your identity and where is like your particular incentive. We think individual incentives can align amongst like different people over a period of time, so like you don't necessarily have to ascribe to a common community incentive, but once like everyone's like most like say women's incentives align in terms of hey we want to be able to vote etc., that's when you manage to like get that kind of change. Secondly, at that point, we think people are still likely to opt in towards supporting these particular movements. Say like in the case of like Rohingya Muslims, we think white cishet people probably won't opt in to like support these movements anyway, but we think on our side of the paradigm, the people who do opt in and end up supporting these particular movements do it probably in better ways, work harder etc., simply because they're going to be expecting some degree of return on investment because their incentives align. That means when incentives align, you probably are more invested in the outcome. This is a stronger incentive than like their empathy or trust incentive that they're trying to bring to you within this particular debate. Secondly, we also think it's always like in community interest to go ahead and align on certain particular issues, which means SJMs still end up existing. You pool in your resources, you like get more like critical mass, etc. What is their case then hinged upon? We think it's fundamentally hinged upon the idea of like say proximity, empathy, etc. You are able, once you're able to like sort of like extend this empathy to other particular individuals, the world probably ends up being better off. I'm going to break this argument down in my first extension, right? So like, when you treat people and build relationships purely on the basis of empathy, we think that means you're also building these relationships purely on the basis of proximity. This is because empathy is fundamentally based on being able to identify with different people and find common identity characteristics. That's more likely when you're more in proximate surroundings with these particular people. Why does that fall? First reason. One, we think that empathy always ends up falling when you have to bear any sort of personal cost. Which means when your actions are motivated by empathy but there is some personal cost, that empathy probably ends up falling because you care more about the personal cost. However, in terms of like incentives and shit like that, you probably still end up doing whatever you were doing because you expect some kind of return at the end of it. The delta here is purely the end return and your investment in that particular return. Secondly, I think like,
the concept is not about individual interest aligning. At a point of time, because of spread of hyper-individualism, I recognize that he will not think twice before fucking me over for any semblance of personal benefit. How does trust begin in any sort of professional or personal collaboration?
Trust is not important. We don't think you care that much about trust. I think that trust only needs to extend insofar as you both care about the same end goal. Your team, both members of your team care about winning finals, which means all your incentives are aligned towards this winning of finals. You don't need to trust in each other to be able to do that. You need to focus on your ability and shit like that. Moving on, I think it's fundamentally principally unfair to extend empathy on the basis of just like proximity, right? The reason for this is what Riddhi tells you. It's like your birth is fundamentally a lottery. Where you're born, what you're doing, who you're proximate with, that's not something that's largely in your control. Because empathy is linked with identification, that means your positive actions purely also extend to people who you are proximate with. The reason this is unfair is, hey, if there are starving kids in Africa, even though they're facing like more of a problem than people in my proximity are facing, the amount of empathy I'm able to extend to them drastically falls purely on the basis of proximity. However, if I go ahead and care about those people because I have some common incentive, hey, maybe I'm like the fucking China and I want to neo-colonize Africa, at that point I think I can probably end up doing better for these particular people in the first place. We think like these particular incentives, non-empathy incentives, such as like fulfillment of obligations, which we think you still end up doing on our side of the paradigm, simply because hey, nobody wants to be in debt to another people, that makes you feel bad, and at the point in time you're not in debt and your debt is fulfilled, you feel good, so it's a personal incentive, it's individualism. And other things, simply like self-interest, wanting to preserve yourself, preserve your community, yada yada yada. That's the thing. So in terms of narrative control, I think like what the state fundamentally wants is compliance and not being able to like question these particular things. We think people in positions of privilege have the ability to like control and shape narratives within this particular proximity. Riddhi gives you historical framing, and it's likely that these things continue along these same lines on their particular counterfactual. This particular narrative control continues to exist, and society, the only reason society even became hyper-individualistic in the first place, and especially managed to rise rapidly, was simply because of this consequence of information exchange and things of that sort. Impact on their side is just more oppression and stuff like that. On our side, simply because there are more narratives you can probably opt into, you can probably like actually get some degree of marginal change, which means, for example, if I am a Dalit, if for like hundreds of years my only interaction has been Brahmins telling me, oh, you did like bad shit in your past, like that's why you're this way, etc., I have no ability to opt out of this narrative. But now when I have access to information, I can actively opt into other different narratives, increase my personal like information, etc., and at that point I can choose whatever aligns best for me. Yeah, CJ.
I'm a selfish person. I have apple. I know that my friend's hungry. I'm likely to not share that apple because I'm hyper individual.
If you want to be friends with this person forever and you want to build a stronger friendship and shit like that, you think they provide positive value to your life, individualism says, yeah, you fucking share that apple. Moving on. In terms of micro level actual impacts, in terms of emotional labor, etc., OG on relationships is this. Relationships are fundamentally and contingent on trust. We think that's not true and we think that's bad because note about the fucked up power dynamics I actually tell you about and Riddhi tells you about. Which means, say, if I'm a woman and I'm in a weaker position in society than men, it's likely that men probably use me and extract as much emotional labor out of me as they possibly can. At the point in time, I'm not individualistic. I probably still keep opting into this narrative because again, there's a complete lack of counter narratives that I can actually opt into. Which means the fulfillment and my personal self-actualization significantly goes down, and the people in power manage to get whatever they want from various communities they oppress and then simply fuck off. On our side, we don't think things like toxic relationships and emotional labor happens to the sheer degree that it happens on their side, simply because the incentive to go into a relationship is to get your own self-actualization, get fulfillment, and to fulfill whatever needs that you may have, sexual needs, emotional needs, etc., etc., etc. For all those reasons, very important.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Taking the largest idea on opposition out of this debate, right? Opening opposition tells you that, hey, self-actualization becomes much better off when you have hyper-individualism as the set narrative to begin with. Understand, firstly, self-actualization is contingent on an objective assessment of self, right? Which means forming perceptions about yourself, taking in information that you get from the outside. Which means, at a point in time when you have the only source of access to forming perceptions being yourself, opening opposition had to prove why you become the best actor for having self-actualization completely in isolation when all of your perceptions exist in isolation to begin with. Understand, manufactured choice exists in the world, which means at a point in time when you have no different legitimate authority in your mind to question your own beliefs, to question your own opinions about yourself, this means you're more likely to gaslight yourself into believing stuff that you want to, which means self-actualization, even if it happens on opposition, is polluted in the first place. This means free from only people who get to access self-actualization who are free from manufactured choice, right? These people are largely privileged people. Understand, information asymmetry exists in society, which is to say that, hey, if I am a privileged person, I'm probably able to access sources beyond manufactured choice, which means I'm able to access self-actualization better off. At worst, self-actualization becomes polluted on that side. At best, it becomes limited in the first place. Cool. At that point of time, what is the most likely counterfactual to begin with? Cool. We say that, hey, hyper-individualism is not an a priori harm. The rise of it is. Which means that, hey, if you want to access hyper-individualism as a means of self-preservation, you should be able to do that. You should be able to do that as a choice. At a point in time when you have rise of hyper-individualism, this means that, hey, even if I don't want to particularly opt into this narrative, there are societal pressures forcing me to opt into this narrative, forcing me to opt into the social norm to begin with, which means you don't have that choice on their side to begin with. Cool. On that first piece of extension, the benefits of hyper-individualism or any sort of value that you derive from being hyper-individualistic and the access thereof. Understand that accessing benefits from any sort of hyper-individualism is contingent on you having some sort of socio-economic capital to begin with. I access having a platform for my individual choice, for my individual opinions, for vouching for my problems when I come from a place of privilege. I just have a larger platform to begin with. For most vulnerable people, this platform does not exist in the first place. Does not exist in the first place. At that point of time, understand that most people within developing nations don't have any access to exercising these benefits in the first place. Which means at best on op, any benefits that you derive from hyper-individualism exclusively lie to privileged people in the first place, because that is the only mechanism through which I can vouch for my own problems, but vulnerable people cannot. The impact of this becomes, this disproportionate benefit becomes principally wrong on their side. Understand also, on a tangible harm, if the platform for discussing problems is only accessible by the most privileged in the society, this means that the visibility to the problems of the most privileged is something that gets far more accentuated in the first place, right? This creates a domino effect where you have privileged people forming narratives, being legitimized for forming narratives, because that is the norm on the op world. They are legitimized as exclusive setters of narratives. The vulnerable people become much worse off because they can't even claim space in the narrative setting sphere to begin with. They don't have access at first. Cool. Second piece of extension in terms of what are these narrative setting structures, what are their incentives to propagate this narrative, and why are these incentives perverse to begin with. Understand, power superstructures want buy-in into their power dynamic that already exists. They want to suppress choice, they want to suppress information. Modern world has vast reservoirs of disseminating information. Information for people exists higher right now than it has ever before, which means that these superstructures are at a greater threat of toppling their power, like hegemony, than ever before. At that point of time, how do we co-opt compliance, and why compliance is much worse off on opt-in? Understand, power superstructures want a dark forest road where people stay in the dark, people don't question anybody, and nobody comes out to question anybody because the norm is to stay compliant. The idea is, in this world where in this world without hyper-individualism, threat to power structures exist. This is important even if the threat doesn't actualize to some tangible change, because the threat in and of itself has value. What does this look like? This is where Himan's POI becomes extremely important. This means that hyper-individualism excuses the rich people from caring about society to begin with, which means how do we differentiate ourselves from OG? It's not like, oh, you have philanthropy because you care for other people. Even above that, this means that it affirmative action, etc., on an individual level, like donating, etc. Even if you do purely for optical value, you do it on our side simply because social pressure to do that exists. Even if you don't do it from a point of, hey, I want to particularly do it, social pressure makes sure that these structures degrade. At that point of time, hyper-individualism then becomes the exclusive tool for the privileged to ensure that no conglomeration of the least privileged happens. The idea is simple. It's visualize economies of scale, right? The cost of education in a village of 60 people versus a village of 1 person. When you have 60 children, the cost drives down. The idea then magnifies to scale of ideologies or ideologies of scale in the first place. This means that social justice movements don't work on offside. How does this happen? Understand, if I belong to a racial minority and I vouch for my own individual problems, I probably don't have any means for that problem being redressed in the first place, right? How do I get any sort of redressal? Is in terms of, hey, me opting into the larger social justice movement to begin with, right? So at that point of time, I have to sideline my individual problems, probably opt into some mainstream before I move on to POI.
Yeah. But if your harm is lack of access, the goal is to improve access, make it a norm. The frame we give you is the whole reason behind this hyper-individualism is enforced pride, which means that when you want this objective version of self, it only happens on our side because you have access to these counter narratives you guys not engage.
Cool. The idea becomes simple in terms of how my next extension fits in with, which is to say how collaboration affects any sort of tangible change, right? Understands the modern hustle culture pushes people into an isolationist narrative. The vast competition is much more cutthroat in the modern world, which means that people are pushed into individualist spaces, right? This means in developing nations especially, collaboration exists as the exclusive mechanism for support structures. Opening doesn't tell you why collaboration leads to any sort of change to begin with. That is something that we bring into the debate, which means you have greater representation of problems if you have wider movements existing in the first place, which affects change. Understand also on the idea of interpersonal relationships and why they become better off on our side. Interpersonal relationships bring cathartic value to you, right? In isolationist moments of my life, I look for support structures. In a hyper-individualistic world, I still do that, but since the narrative is that relationships are purely transactional, I only go to this person for selfish reasons, this means that you never know authenticity of a person's actions, which means that everybody acting out of self-interest means that this degrades trust to a large extent. We have better relations to exist simply because perception is not transactional. At that point of time, take this debate, CG.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What does modern society look like in the first place? I think there is an increasing amount of fascist states. To a certain extent, you have an increasing amount of subtle and explicit oppression. You have gender bias. For fuck's sake, the world is dying, right? You need to understand that this is why this individual level becomes incredibly important, because you have to go ahead and take the baby step to even think about the larger society in the first place. If I don't think about myself, I cannot go ahead and think about you in the first place. I think that's a basic realization you need to have. Secondly, I think the entirety of GovBench is reliant on one particular premise, that the entire world is going to become an anarchy, right? I think this is a retrospective debate. This is a regrets motion, and I think they had to go ahead and prove to you that all the harms that they have claiming have occurred in the first place. I don't think that social justice movements do not exist. I don't think people go ahead and do not do charity. I don't think people do not do donations. I think all of these things exist, and why do they exist? I'm going to go ahead and prove to you. I think there are a couple of extensions in this debate. Firstly, in terms of why prioritizing yourself, prioritizing everyone is an unfair burden. I have 5 layers of analysis to this. Number 1, in terms of the kind of structures that go ahead and exist, right? These are incredibly huge. They probably are embedded within the larger state and things like that to begin with. And that is where this personal realization becomes incredibly important, because at all points in time, a lot of times you have to go ahead and deal with them on an individual basis. I think this individual reactions become incredibly important, because towards changing stimulus, everyone does not react to the changing stimulus in a similar manner. And at that point in time, I need to go ahead and think about the larger structures and how to go ahead and deal with it by accumulating all my broken spaces to begin with. Secondly, I think it's an emotional burden to put on an individual who has been incredibly oppressed to go ahead and think about others to begin with. I think it's an incredibly high amount of burden, because the third layer of analysis is also true, because it's an extra layer of oppression for them to begin with, because you go ahead and villainize them that, hey, listen, you have to think about others at all points in time. You cannot go ahead and prioritize yourself to begin with. But fourthly, note that in status quo in modern society, you have movements coming up for self-care. You have movements going ahead and thinking about yourself and prioritizing your mental health and things like that, which means that emergence of that completely stops on the entirety of government, but also to a certain extent the kind of growth that they have made completely to a certain extent retards, because you go ahead and villainize them. But fifthly, I think in order to go ahead and develop as an individual, your ability to go ahead and acknowledge problems is incredibly important. That personal development is largely important to begin with. I think the weighing of this argument is twofold. One, I think it's an additional layer of villainization that happens on their side of the house. But two, to a certain extent, you need to understand that this individualizing of blame that happens on the entirety of Gov's world is completely to a certain extent worse off, and that collectively happens on government's world. Secondly, I think the entire case is built on that social justice movements will not exist. My second extension is as to why collectivization is likely on our side of the house. Number 1, I think it's an identification of issue. I think OO says that it's like access to information is going to improve, so we'll just understand issues. Like, I mean, information is also controlled by a lot of people, so I'm unsure to a certain extent how that information is going to help you. But more importantly, you need to understand it's a shallow case, because we need to understand that in order to go ahead and understand as an individual as to what your issues are, it becomes incredibly important for you to be hyper individualistic and think in and out to begin with, right? We think this is crucially important, because not every individual is irrational. I think to a certain extent on our side of the house, people are also going to be rational in terms of understanding that utility essentially goes ahead and exists in individualism, but also in terms of how this utility is going to increase at a point in time we go ahead and come together to begin with. Because we think that to a certain extent the third layer of analysis is also true, because of the fact that we understand this resonation is becoming incredibly important. I think at a point in time I and Anjani realized that both of our causes are incredibly same. I think to a certain extent you're going to go ahead and come together. That resonation power is incredibly important. But fourthly, I think to think about the fact together, because I think as an individual you also realize that my ability to go ahead and deal with the larger state or power structures is incredibly difficult to begin with on an individual capacity. I think you have to go ahead and understand that when you come together, to a certain extent you're largely going to go ahead and improve that sort of bargaining chip. I think the way bargaining chip becomes important is something that I go ahead and prove to you on our side of the house. This likelihood is completely missing from opening opposition. That is why the weighing of this argument is twofold. One, I think on certainty we go ahead and prove to you as to why this collectivization is largely going to occur. But two, on scale, I think social justice movements are largely better off. But thirdly, in terms of accountability, I think concepts of understanding what is mental health, what is space in relationships, what to a certain extent in terms of going ahead and talking about each other or me thinking about myself is incredibly important. We need to understand as to how patriarchy has emerged in the very first place, right? It has always emerged from the fact that women are asked to go ahead and think about their family, are asked to go ahead and think about the society to begin with. And we think this becomes incredibly important, because at a point in time this individual or hyper-individualistic society largely comes about, our ability to go ahead and deal with this larger structures becomes incredibly important, because you realize that your utility, be it sexual, be it solace, be it emotional, be it physical, all of these things to a certain extent become your priority. I think at this point in time, to a certain extent, Avika is also going to go ahead and say that, listen, I probably do not want to go ahead and like deep down, deprioritize my mental health to not have a relationship or things like that to begin with. I think to a certain extent, you need to understand that this hyper-individualism goes ahead and changes dynamics of relationships and things like that to begin with. I think on our side of the house, the weighing is twofold. One, I think the discourses with respect to mental health, by becoming
even like coffee table conversations are largely to a certain extent more prioritized, but also in terms of how you go ahead and shape the trajectory of the entire movement is largely better off on our side. The impact of that is twofold. One, I think this domino effect becomes incredibly important because the peer group also becomes better, your mental health improves, and that is why your group becomes important. But secondly, you know that your spaces have been violated. You ask for accountability on our side of the house, and that is why to a certain extent you're also going to ask these corporate structures for donations, for charity, for going ahead and doing accountability, for doing their fucking CSR. I'm not sure why that doesn't happen. Our last extension is with respect to policy creation. Panel, for far so long, state has built itself on welfare mass. Conscription as a concept also exists that, hey, listen, you have to give up your life for others because you will be glorious and things like that. We think that indoctrination does not only come from state but also from, say, like religion also existing together and things like that to begin with. I think this hyper-individualism is so important because it enables you to go ahead and overcome these internalized biases and oppression to begin with. Your ability to go ahead and deal with education, the propaganda that essentially goes ahead and exists, becomes incredibly important because individualism has failed, panel, and that is why we think this hyper-individualism becomes incredibly important in this larger society, because the kind of propaganda and the kind of weight has been embedded with the society is far so long. The impact of that is threefold. One, I think government thinks more because the government now realizes that people are to be more prioritized than economy, and you cannot go ahead and give up the entire society to begin with. But secondly, that evasion by accountability is called out by people. People talk about as to how to a certain extent I have to hold myself, hold the state accountable and things like that. But thirdly, I think the demand for more policies about myself becomes incredibly important. I think the narratives that I matter more than economy are only possible on CO.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Most of op is out because most of op is inexclusive. I'll prove to you why. One, I think opening op's larger idea is that SJMs are likely to exist because you're continuously going to think in individual ways, but I am not sure as to how they might be powerful. We think that most people understand what's wrong with society is the idea that you have to bend state so that it complies with you, which simply means, one, we think that community support is the most important thing within this debate. OG talks about it, never mechanizes it. I do that. Why? One, we think that state redressal is only likely to occur when you want to appear, or state redressal is likely to occur because state wants to appear as if it is catering to a large audience, which means that state has incentives of catering to a huge chunk of people for voter incentives, for things such as like getting donations or even things such as gaining popular support, which means that at the point of time you cater to the maximum voter base, you probably have a large collective of people supporting you. We think that at the point of time you also have a large collective, you're likely to be able to sway media, which means that media covers things which gains the most TRP value. We think that at the point of time you have a large number of people supporting a certain thing or bashing the state on a certain thing, TRP or media is likely to cover you a lot, which means that government has an incentive of wanting to avoid TRP backlash, media backlash. At that point, state is likely to cater to you more simply because it wants to avoid backlash, it wants to not lose out on popular voter support, it wants to not lose out on like donations, etc. But secondly, we think that the idea of incentives or the idea of social upliftment is extremely important. This being a retrospective debate, our counterfactual is simple. You probably prioritize community support, you probably prioritize communism. Not communism, but like community support, communal support, right? What happens because of that? One, we think that the narrative then shifts to you having to be good because your community needs you to, which simply means that at all points of time, as a privileged person, I probably don't have people shouting around me, look, I'm a terrible person for not donating to like poorest of people. We don't think that the poor majority is going to like get the same sort of narrative because poor people are already fucking poor. We think that the richest people, the people at the top of the food chain, are likely to be continuously surrounded by how it's a good thing to like donate, or it's a good thing, or it's the right thing to go ahead and donate. Which means that any form of social upliftment only ever occurs when people around you or the popular narrative around you becomes about how you have to donate because that's the inherently right thing to do. But even then, we think that corporations are likely to donate more because the narrative then becomes you as a corporation are supposed to donate, or you as a rich person, a privileged person are supposed to donate because that's the right thing to do. But thirdly, we think that opening op's idea is that if you have more info, you probably have become a better person.
Except I'm unsure as to why you would share that info so that people on a at large become better. Why is that true? We think that resources are limited, information is spread asymmetrically, you're likely to prioritize your own self because you are going to you're going to have hyper focus on yourself. Why is that true? We think that most corporations already pit you against each other because they have incentives of getting the maximum amount of work out of you, which means that they prioritize having most amount of efficiency. But secondly, you probably do that to break popular support. Why is that true? Corporations do not want backlash, which means that if I can probably spread out the herd or thin out the herd, I probably don't get as much flack. Which means that at the point of time I'm competing with Kunal on speaker scores, I probably don't call out the cap or probably don't call out some other person in the tournament because I probably am competing. And this also takes out the idea of an incentive that they talk about. Why is that true? Even though me and Kunal or me and Naman or me or Krishaang have the same incentive of wanting to win this trophy, we are still competing. The incentives might align, but we still think you're pitted against each other at all points of time, which means that at no point of time do you essentially support each other insofar as I'm competing against each other or we're competing against each other. Incentives might align, that does not mean you have more community support or you have support at large. But fourthly, the idea of proximity. We think that the larger idea is when you have more people or you want to form a community, you probably want to make sure that you have cross-national relationships or cross-national sense of support as well. Which means that at large, you probably want to relate with someone from USA as well, simply because you are likely to feel bad about a certain thing at all points of time. The idea of hyper-individualism is unlikely to help you out with this because at all points I'm already restricted to my only geographical boundary. This means I probably think from my own perspective as opposed to the largest perspective of how it might affect more people. What does that do? Two things. One, I'm unlikely to get support simply because I'm unlikely to be able to be relatable to a large population, which means that at the point of time I'm relatable or at the point of time I have larger support, I'm likely to be able to bend the state more or get more rights out of the state, collectivize more. But secondly, you're also going to be able to get more financial support, more emotional support. Within developing countries, most developing countries are already fairly scattered. We think that this becomes the most important thing within this debate because often these developing countries do not have the monetary support to help each other out. We think that at the point of time you collectivize, you can probably support each other a lot more. But fourthly, and this takes out most of CO, if CO's idea is that hey, mental health gets better because you think from an individual's point of view, we think that the continuous amount of support that I get from people around me becomes the most important thing. Often the idea of isolationism makes you feel worse about yourself simply because at all points you feel like you're alone, you're isolated. With that we think that often your mental health becomes worse because you're likely to pit yourself against each other or you're likely to pit yourself against the people around you. We think that you often feel extremely alone in that case, but you often do not have any support whatsoever. I Riddhi.
Give me one line of merit as to why hyper-individualism exists in a vacuum and not in an ecosystem of other actors, which we tell you on OO and then CO derives.
Hyper-individualism is a narrative, which means that you're likely to keep pitting yourself against each other. What that simply does is that even if it is not existing in a vacuum, you're likely to have a continuous rise in the narrative or continuous growth in the narrative. The comparative here is you're likely to have more communal support as opposed to hyper-individualism, which means that you're likely to support each other more as opposed to keep pitting yourself against each other. But this is where we take over our OG. We think that OG has a lot of right ideas but never mechanizes any of them. One, we think that the idea of why community support might be important is something that they never explain. We tell you why state incentives become the most important thing within this debate because state is likely to bend to your will more when you have a lot more people. But secondly, TRP incentives are likely to help you out a lot more when you have a lot of people rallying with you for a common cause. We think that at that point of time you're likely to get more support from the state. But fourthly, we think that the idea of how bargaining chips become the most important thing within this debate because for any social justice movement to even succeed, you want a large amount of support. Manpower becomes the most important thing because you want to cater to the most amount of people on their side of the house. You're probably catering to yourself, you're probably catering to your own proximate people. On our side, you're catering to a larger audience. We think that that's an inherent benefit because more people are better off on our side because you can collectivize more, you can help more people out. We think we clearly take this debate very, very proud.
Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I cry about my breakup. I won't have a conversation about it because I constantly gaslight myself. I constantly internalize the guilt because society has be a bigger person. Society has told me to accept that sorry and then move on. This is the very burden Narayan talks to you about, because this is the very burden which goes ahead and creates villainization when it comes to social movement, which goes ahead and creates villainization when individual wants to go ahead and talk about their mental health issues and things like that. We are very different coming from opening opposition, right? Primarily because opening opposition just goes ahead and harps upon the idea that hey, self-actualization happens. I think CG is supposed to be credited for their response in terms of like self-actualization when it is contingent upon information and when information is controlled by privilege and there is a propaganda existing which people don't realize. I don't think self-actualization is possible, but they never tell you what is the value of self-actualization. But thirdly and most importantly, what is self-actualization translates into? Because there's half about the idea that hey, social justice movement. What is the harm on social justice movement? How the trajectory actually changes. It never comes in their speeches. They just give say 14 minutes of framing. I don't think you can actually credit them for this. But more importantly, let's talk about what is the Gov case in general. What does Gov bring to you in this debate? Let's talk about opening Gov. I think opening Gov's larger idea in terms of like you going ahead and being a collective society. You need to understand the larger reason why communal disputes exist is primarily because the very competition which exists within the community. I think they live in a weird world where there is one global community that never happens. It's important for you to understand that there are multiple communities existing simultaneously, which means that if the only idea you want to talk about is the hope and hate and trust are the things which you want to talk about, it's something which never happens in your world. But if you want to talk about like collaboration, I think Narayan's analysis exclusively goes ahead and tells you how collaboration is something which is largely inexclusive. You go ahead and harp upon the idea that privileged have to go ahead and realize that they have to do like things like Catholicism and then go ahead and give money. And this is the same thing which CG wants to talk about as to how their idea is very weird, right? The only reason why welfare state and philanthropy exist in the first place is because these people are good actors. That's not necessarily true because they never really explain what is this, why this empathy is so influential that Bill Gates goes ahead and cares about people dying in Namibia, right? I tell you why that is not true. Because of PR and controlling narrative. Bill Gates owned that to go ahead and open these trusts and things like that, primarily because he wants to get the goodwill of people, which means individual incentive. And this individual incentive translates into commercial incentive, which makes it much stronger reason for you to go ahead and care about these things, even if you don't go ahead and like care about, let's say, people dying in Namibia. But also, when it comes to like collaboration and things like that, I think two problems with CG and like OG altogether. One in terms of like likelihood analysis, I think Narayan tells you that world won't end into anarchy. But more importantly, the counterfactual is very weird. Considering Narayan's framing stand that people are individualistic and now hyper-individualistic primarily because this is human reaction and human adaptation which is very normal to the changing stimuli of a capitalist world where there is a constant rat race, I don't think you can actively go ahead and regret it retrospectively. But more importantly, if you want to go ahead and regret it, what you then need to realize that you are going ahead and villainizing the larger chunk of people who are normally, humanly, like evolving to the changing stimuli. I don't think they can regret it. But more importantly, if they want to talk about relationship, I think that is a real contradiction in their case because they're largely talking about things like sacrifices. The very reason things like sacrifices exist because you value the other person more, because you value the relationship more. That is the very reason why things like sacrifice happen more in their world. Quickly dealing with CG, case is largely similar. Resource crunch is largely inexclusive. State compliance, I think this is the extension they want to run. If you want to talk about state coming into a middle ground and then having policy changes, you never really tell me why people should settle for these policy changes. Considering the gap which exists between the people who are fighting for a policy change versus the state, I think it becomes important that who is actually controlling what you actually come on a common ground. It literally looks like state going ahead and directing you, hey, just give up on all these rights, but have right to vote as a woman. And I think that's the best possible thing you can actually want. I don't really see why it is good for people, good for minorities in general. They never really compare it as a whip. But more importantly, I think the larger idea on CG is very similar to what OG is harping about, but they never really prove to you what is the exclusivity of things they are crying about, considering only thing they cry about is the fact that philanthropy exists. But now, dealing with opening opposition. One, opening opposition wants to talk about self-actualization and alienation. I already dealt with why their premise of information is wrong. But second, in terms of like collaboration, and this is important because I Riddhi Mukherjee's speech is largely based upon bigger the deterrence, you need to fight the bigger deterrence, you need bigger reasons to fight for it. And this is based upon alignment of like incentives. This is important for you to understand what Narayan does. One, creation of resonance, which means their whole analysis is based upon identification of problem. Identification of the problem is the analysis which Narayan talks to you about, which only happens when people who exist. This not only happens with relatability, it creates the very likelihood for people going ahead and stepping into protest. But second, I think this is more important because people just don't go ahead and feel like, oh, 5 women are having a problem, let's start a protest. That's not how life works. It works on you going ahead and having individual bargaining chip. People realize that individual bargaining chip is very, very low. This again goes ahead and give you one utility, but second, possibility of you going ahead and having potential impact and understanding and realizing your proximate incentives. That is the very reason why OVO's case now would stand in this debate. But more importantly, I think OVO also wants to talk about relationship. Never really they impacted. They just say that, hey, now women would realize that there is a power dynamic and they would realize how relationship works. I don't really see how any of these things translate into any sort of an impact. The reason why we take over OVO is 14 minutes of framing and 0 impacts in general. But more important, what you get in Narayan's speech, 2 analytical extensions. One on the lines of A, how collaboration happens. I think OVO also talks about it. How we make it different is we give you we deal with a likely idea what happens in gov case. I think villainization becomes an important point because this is not only a hard analysis as to how the social movements would not only A, on scale would face a major impact in terms of potential social movement would not come into the picture, but second in terms of gravity. People who are right now fighting feel delegitimized. State going ahead and cracking down on them becomes more and more legitimate because society itself accepts that it is okay for you to become a bigger person and accept authority. But second, in terms of individual relationship, I think OVO's idea is just only in terms of power dynamics. We tell you how it goes ahead and progresses into people understanding space because it becomes logically viable for my husband to understand that we are even after a marriage, we are not one soul, we are 2 different individuals. You have to listen to me in general. Why you would listen to me is simple because you go ahead and care about emotional dependence you have. You care about things like you care about other things as well. But more importantly, vertical extensions are very simple in terms of policy making. I think it's very simple when we prove to you the likelihood of accountability and check you can have on policy making. And lastly, in terms of mental health, how there is a domino effect when it comes to discourse. Panel, I think we surely live in a world which is not happy. But if me fighting for myself makes me sleep better at night, I don't think anyone has the right to villainize me for it.